lot of important and useful information for you. For potentially for your management plans, but for future wildlife professionals. If I don't finish it today, we'll finish this on Wednesday.
Have we finished the other one?
That's where I was going next.
Okay.
We're also gonna finish any other ones that we didn't finish, such as the food plot one from, what, a month ago or whatever, on Wednesday. And then I wanna have plenty of time, there'll be plenty of time left over to talk to each one of your groups. I wanna hear very thoroughly and maybe even see examples of how it's coming so far and what you got so far. I want to be sure everybody's on track, nobody's getting behind, nobody's getting hung up. Sound good? Cool. How are the plans coming? Okay.
We thought of a pretty good plan of what we know we want to work on and what we can and can't work on.
Okay. All right, good. Y'all's, how are y'all in the writing?
Yeah.
We are? Sounds like one of you is and one of you isn't.
I'm doing an intro.
That's what we talked about.
Okay. And so are y'all, when are we starting the prescription?
When I finish the intro.
Okay,
We've got a lot of ideas though.
We have a lot of ideas.
good, okay. Getting it organized, you can be working on maps and graphics and all that good stuff.
Okay.
Yeah, one map, one down,
I don't know.
30 to go.
We have lots of pictures of the property too.
Okay, okay. All right. How about y'all,
It's going.
Tyler? Started writing yet?
I'm gonna start writing it tonight. I'm gonna get the introduction and get her on some numbers for the budget. Just getting ballpark prices, please.
Yes, Liv? Okay, cool.
We just started writing ours. We're still waiting to hear back from second guy we told you the email.
Okay. Have you been to the place yet?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, we talked to the guy that told us, but we haven't heard from like the primary guy on stuff.
I press pretty hard. Yeah. Our grade depends on this, and if we don't hear from you soon, we're gonna have to do something different or something. We're getting desperate, make them feel bad for you. Okay. Does anybody have any experience with wetland management or any classes that have dealt with any aspect of that? Maybe not. I assume not.
Besides the wetlands course I took.
Took the wetlands course, what's that?
Just working at
Working at
Duck
Duck
River.
River, so yeah, real live, practical experience, good. So this is gonna kind of help you back up to the 30,000-foot view and get a hopefully better feel for how what you were doing fits into the larger management procedures. Okay. Who's taking the wetland course? Love you? Okay. So there's, you could break down wetlands in a lot of ways, into dozens of ways, but 5 primary types of wetlands are palustrine or palestrine wetlands, which is marshes and swamps. What's the difference between a marsh and a swamp?
Swamps have trees.
Swamps have trees, that's a perfect way of saying it, good. And marshes don't. Riverine or riparian wetlands are along rivers and streams. We often think of those as floodplains, right? Lacustrine or lacustrine wetlands are along lakes. In Tennessee, we only have one natural lake, Reelfoot. So what other lakes might we have that could be considered lacustrine systems? River oxbows, old river channels. When the river channel moves, that old piece of channel gets isolated and persists for several years or decades. If it's really big, that could be considered a lacustrine system, like a lake, an isolated lake. Coastal areas also have marine wetlands and estuarine, where rivers come into the ocean. These, each kind of have their characteristics, but they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, right? You could have a river oxbow along a river. You could have marshes and swamps along rivers. So they all can kind of intervene. what percent of wetlands in the United States have we lost, have been drained, roughly?
90%?
About 50 to 55%,
Mhm.
okay? What decade did we start doing a lot of work to start reclaiming and restoring wetlands in the United States? Does anybody know, remember from Principles of Wildlife Management class? In the 1980s. I know that was a long time ago to you guys. but-
Dang, I was
but,
gonna say 70s.
So I was where you were sitting when that was happening. So it was a time when there was a lot of legislation from the Farm Bill's Wetland Reserve Program to the North American Waterfowl Management Plan to the Accelerated Wetlands Acquisition Act, many others, where we started, restoring wetlands. Guys, I'm going to talk a lot about it, and when people talk about wetland management, they often kind of infer or imply or assume that we're talking about kind of creating or managing artificial systems. I want to make real clear, an artificial wetland is not as good as a natural wetland. And the best thing that we can do with a functional natural wetland is let the damn thing alone. Just let it do its job, let it do its thing, right? Now, having said that, most of our wetlands, especially around here in West Tennessee, are, even though they might be natural, they're dysfunctional. We've screwed them up during the 1900s, starting in the late 1800s, when the Corps of Engineers, we brought them in to help us by doing what to our rivers? Not in West Tennessee, no.
Straightening them.
Yeah, what's that called? What's that called?
It's not a meander,
It's the opposite of meandering, yeah. Channelizing our rivers. Taking earth-moving equipment where you've got a meandering river and making it go straight, right? And taking all those downriver segments of it and putting them into that straight channel. What was our intent? What was society trying to do?
Stop flooding.
Stop flooding, that's right. Because flooding was flooding crops, it was flooding people's homes and towns along rivers. Where's the most fertile soil? Down along rivers. Why is it so fertile there? Because rivers flood, and they're always dumping deposits of organic matter and nutrients. And all that flooding is what makes the soil so rich, but that's also what makes it impossible to farm those areas, right? So we channelized it so that those rivers would push water down faster during floods, right? But in the process of building a channel, you scoop the dirt out of the channel, and where do you put it? On either side, right? So what do you create on either side of the channel? A levee. And what happens when it rains? The water runs downhill until it gets to the levee, and then it ponds up behind the levees. So you have places like Crockett Bottoms, and when you drive down Highway 45 and cross over the Middle Fork of the Obion and see that ponded area on the left of the dead trees, and a million other places like that. We've destroyed our wetland functioning, that ability for wetlands, for rivers to flood and recede, right? Rivers are not the channel. Rivers are the floodplain, and the floodplain is complex. Every year, on average, a natural functioning river floods. And on average, about every decade or so, it's a big ass flood, right? And on average, every century or so, there's a great big flood. That's all the floodplain, right? And when we do things in the annual floodplain, we're morons if we think that we're not going to get flooded if it's a functioning wetland, because it'll flood every single year almost, right? So we should leave them alone. And since we haven't, because of the Corps in West Tennessee, we have five main river systems in West Tennessee that dump into the Mississippi River. What's the most northern one? Right here around us. The Obion. And then below that, the Fork-a-Deer, and then the Hatchie. And then two smaller ones down by Memphis, the Loosahatchee and the Wolf. Okay. The Hatchie is the only one that's not heavily channelized in West Tennessee. It is channelized in its upper reaches in Mississippi, maybe even Alabama, but not in Tennessee. But that channelization upriver affects it in Tennessee. So we've got programs in place to help us try to restore some of these natural meanders to our screwed up river systems in West Tennessee. Has anybody ever heard of the West Tennessee River Basin Authority? Okay. In the 1970s, a duck hunter from Nashville, he was a lawyer, had a duck club just south of us here, just very near us here. He sued the Corps of Engineers to stop channelizing the rivers of West Tennessee. And the idea was that channelization was bad for duck habitat. And he won. His name's Clark Akers. And for a while, he was kind of a hero. But they did have to stop channelizing, and there's some real complex politics. And were any of you in my policy class where I made you read the book? Yeah, Rivers Under Siege. So in that book, it talks a lot about that lawsuit and the slow process of trying to get our rivers restored. But an agency was created within the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation called the West Tennessee River Basin Authority. And part of what their job is to try and restore some of the natural functioning of our West Tennessee rivers. Okay. There's also the Wetland Reserve Program, which I think you know is one of the conservation programs within the Farm Bill, like the Conservation Reserve Program that we saw a CRP land. Wetland Reserve Program, what does it do? Anybody know? Have you guys all been told this?
Yes.
Okay, who doesn't remember? If you don't raise your hand, I'm gonna call on you. Who doesn't remember? Okay, what does it do?
I think it takes wetlands under protection and moves them on.
Does what? Takes wetlands?
Takes wetlands under protection and moves them on.
No. It takes row crops that were once wetlands and returns them to wetland conditions, right? The Conservation Reserve Program operates usually under contracts that last how long? Conservation Reserve Program, the CRP.
10 years.
10 years, that's right. The Wetland Reserve Program, primarily, how long does that last? Forever. Forever. There is the 30-year option, there's the 15-year option, but most of it is forever. It's a perpetual easement, okay? That means you can never row crop it again. And a lot of landowners have been very reluctant to enroll in that because it's like, I'm a farmer, what am I gonna do? I can't farm it. But they've come to realize that these areas in the annual floodplain, they're flooding all the time, and the only way I'm making money off of them is crop insurance, and I hardly make anything with that. It's not worth it. So they're slowly, coming on board with putting stuff into the Wetland Reserve Program. The Wetland Reserve Program used to be its own program. Now it's a provision within another program, and I'll get to that later. I forget the name of the other program at the moment, but I'll come back to that later, okay? So this is an example of West Tennessee River Basin Authority, one of their projects, where they've taken a channelized river and they're restoring the meander. The next step is to plant trees and let this grow back into a bottomland hardwood forest. We've drained 50 to 55% of our wetlands in the United States, but we've eliminated 85% of our bottomland hardwood forests in West Tennessee. And that's winter duck habitat right there. So we're expecting to have as many ducks now with 15% of the habitat we used to have. And I'm going to come back later to how we can pull that off. Okay. So managing waterfowl is managing wetlands, right? And waterfowl are migratory, so we're managing them at breeding grounds, which is Canada and the northern Midwest of the United States. We think in the United States the prairie potholes is the duck factory of the United States. It's nowhere near as much of a duck factory as Canada is, because there's a whole bunch more of Canada than there is of the prairie pothole region centered on North Dakota. Because that's important. But it's been farmed heavily, continues to be. CRP is our main tool for keeping some of those thousands and tens of hundreds of thousands of little lakes, potholes, out of agricultural production in grass around those lakes where those ducks nest. Right? what Canada's faced, massive areas of the southern provinces that are just extraordinary waterfowl habitat, is they decided about 10, 15, 20 years ago that the cost of exploiting their tar sands for petroleum was worth it. Up to that point, it was very expensive to get the petroleum out of the tar sand. They didn't have good technology to do it. But the cost, the value of the petroleum went up. The technology brought the cost of extracting petroleum down to the point where, yep, it was worth it. So they started heavily exploiting tar sands. And the Athabascan tar sand region represents about 5% of the boreal forest of Canada. And that's almost all of it is excellent waterfowl nesting habitat. So 5% of that habitat is being heavily exploited, for tar sands. So when I hear pipeline, from Canada, what I'm thinking is waterfowl habitat. Okay, I've covered this in other classes, but I want to cover it again because I don't think this is something that sticks with students very well, but it should. If you're going to be in the wildlife profession, you need to know and understand this, okay? Two different things. Okay, first of all, you know that waterfowl migrate in 4 migration corridors, right? The Atlantic, the Mississippi, the Central, and the Pacific. And that those corridors, management for harvest along those corridors is managed through the Migratory Bird Treaty, which set up what we call flyway councils. And those flyway councils decide what the harvest is going to be in each of these flyways in the United States and Canada and Mexico, so that it's equal in the lives, okay? Now, that's harvest management. Habitat management is something different. This came out of the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. That's right. They created not flyway councils, that's with the Migratory Bird Treaty. The North American Waterfowl Management Plan created joint ventures. We broke the North America up into different habitat regions significant to ducks, and we have habitat restoration goals on each of those areas. So, Migratory Bird Treaty is about harvest management through the joint ventures, through the flyway councils, and the North American Waterfowl Management Plan is about habitat management through the joint ventures. Know that for the rest of your lives. Okay? Good? You with me? Sure.
Can you put this on canvas?
Yeah, sorry if it's not already. Yeah, sorry. Yes, I will definitely. Okay. All right, and then wintering ground. In Tennessee, of course, that's primarily the Mississippi River that they follow down, but we also have the Tennessee River, and if you're not real familiar, here's the Tennessee River. Well, the Tennessee River's headwaters drop down into Alabama, come back up through Tennessee to the Ohio River, and eventually the Mississippi. And then the Cumberland River is here. And when the Cumberland River and Tennessee River parallel each other, there you have land between the lakes, right? And then they go to the Ohio and then the Mississippi. So where you've got this Tennessee River right here, you have a large national wildlife refuge in Alabama called the Wheeler National Wildlife Refuge. That's a big one, right? Some of you work the Tennessee National Wildlife Refuge right here. Right? And then you've got the Reelfoot, Hatchie, Lower Hatchie, and
Wolf River is a W.
yeah, that's not a national wildlife refuge.
Chickasaw.
Chickasaw, yeah. So Reelfoot, Lake Isom, Hatchie, Lower Hatchie, and Chickasaw are national wildlife refuges there. Okay. So waterfowl migrate. Most waterfowl do. So for most waterfowl, what we're providing is winter habitat, with the exception of wood ducks and some geese. For what it's worth, Canada geese have several subspecies. You may remember this from an earlier class. In West Tennessee, historically, we had the interior subspecies that would migrate down into West Tennessee. And we call that the Mississippi Valley population, the valley of the Mississippi River. Okay, big population. Middle Tennessee and the East Tennessee, there is a population of the giant Canada goose subspecies. This was historically a resident, well, it still is a resident population that came from a kid outside of Nashville in the 1950s, ordered a bunch of eggs from a game farm in North Carolina, incubated them. They turned out to be the subspecies that we thought was extinct. But since, and he let them loose, and since they didn't have any parents teaching them how to migrate, they became a resident flock, and it grew and grew and grew, till it was causing problems, and they started putting them all over the place, including in West Tennessee. So what we have now in West Tennessee is a mix of those interior Mississippi Valley population birds and the giant Tennessee Valley population birds. For what it's worth. Okay?
How can you tell the difference between the two?
I don't.
That's
I
all right.
don't really do. I don't know genetic analysis anymore. Yeah. Okay. When we're managing wetlands, if it's a real natural functioning wetland, the best thing we can do is leave it alone, right? Or try to put it back, restore it with those tools that we talked about. But if it's an area that's no longer a wetland, and we want more wetlands, a lot of the time we're supplementing our natural functioning wetlands, half of them are gone, with artificial wetlands. And those come in three main flavors, okay? And those flavors are flooded grain crops, moist soil units, and green tree reservoirs. The first two are early successional management. The last one is late succession, is forest management, okay? I'm gonna talk about each one. But what they all have in common is that they include levees and some way of pumping water into these levied up systems and some sort of water control structure, all right? And what they all should involve is shallow water, because a diver duck can feed in deep or shallow water, but a dabbler, which is a lot of our ducks of interest, have to have shallow water. So if you have shallow water, you're providing for everybody. If you have deep water, you're only providing for somebody. Okay, so let's talk about flooded grain crops first. Y'all jump in if you have any questions or comments. So a lot of the time, wildlife agencies will lease parts of wildlife management areas, WMAs, as well as national wildlife refuges. They'll do this too, in what they call cooperative farming agreements, CFAs, or cooperative lease agreements. And that's where they allow a farmer to come on and plant crops. And then the farmer will harvest those crops, pay, they'll make some profit. Sometimes they'll pay the agency some, but a lot of the time the way they pay the agency is by leaving a percentage of the crop on the ground, uncut. And that often might be about 10% of the crop. And so they'll leave the crop in the lowest area, nearest the area or in the area that's most likely or going to be flooded first, okay? So we call it grain crops, and we're talking things, corn is king, certainly corn, milo, millet, what's another name for milo? Sorghum, yeah, that's right. Various millets, and in some places, rice as well. We call those hot foods. They're hot because it's just a jargon term, because they'll really attract ducks when it's cold, because they're very high in carbohydrates, okay? And if you think about sources of nutrients, you've got proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, okay? Fats get you a lot of energy, but not fast energy. That's stored, okay? Protein gets you a lot of energy and fast energy, but that's kind of rare. That's gold. That's valuable. It's very expensive and not as common on the landscape. Carbohydrates, your bread, your pasta, is cheap and easy, quick energy. Okay, and that's what they're getting from these grains. They're getting quick energy. And I said it really brings in ducks when it's cold. Okay, it's like candy to ducks when it's cold. When it's not cold, ducks, they'll eat it, but they're just as happy to eat all sorts of other diversity of native vegetation, and they'll spread out. But when it gets really cold, they'll come into those crops. They'll suck into those crops, right? And then they'll spread back out when it warms back up. The bad thing about hot crops is that you're giving them carbohydrates, but you're not giving them all the vitamins and micronutrients and macronutrients that they need. If that's all you're giving, you're feeding your kids candy bars, right? So this can be a percentage to get them through the winter, but you still have to have a whole bunch of that other good stuff, And of course, duck hunters, duck hunters make management a whole lot more complicated than it needs to be. I'll come back to that. Soybeans are not good food for ducks. They will eat soybeans. And they can get a little bit of nutritional value out of soybeans, but not a lot. But one thing that happens in addition to them not getting much value out of them is that they'll eat a lot, and those soybeans will expand in the crop and often impact the crop. So that can potentially kill birds, but they don't get much out of them. Now here's an issue. If soybeans are bad, then should I plant corn every year here? Should I ever plant corn every single year in a place? Why not?
The soil.
It's horrible for the soil. Corn, really pulls nitrogen and other nutrients from the soil, so it's really hard on soil. So after you plant corn in a year, you should rotate the next year and plant a legume, right? The natural legume to plant around here would be soybeans. You could let it go fallow and grow a variety of stuff, including some native legumes. But soybeans would be the thing. But if this is the low area of the field, it has a high area too, and I plant corn here, all corn here this year. Next year I plant all soybeans and I leave 10% of my soybeans. Oh, that's not good for ducks. So what do I need to do? I could plant corn in the bottom, and soybeans in the top. And this year, I harvest the soybeans and leave the corn. Next year I swap. Well, then my corn is going to be up high and it doesn't get flooded. That doesn't work, right? So we have to think about what we plant where, right? We have to plant some corn in the bottom, but some soybeans in the bottom, right? So the corn up high and soybeans high, and you harvest everything except the corn down low, or whatever. But these are things that we have to think through and not just say, hey, yeah, y'all go plant whatever you want to plant and leave 10% of it, because you're going to find half the time you've got nothing good for ducks. You have to really think through that. Make sense? You with me? Okay. The Fish and Wildlife Service is required, according to the North American Waterfowl Management Plan, to provide enough energy on the ground to meet a certain number of what we used to call duck use days. Has anybody ever heard of that? DUDs, or duck energy days? Okay. And we'll talk more. You'll have an assignment later this semester about duck energy days. So they're supposed to leave enough energy, enough food on the ground to provide so many duck energy days. And like each National Wildlife Refuge, and maybe even each WMA, is told, okay, you've got this many acres. We need you to have this many million duck use days or whatever on those acres, okay? Now here's the thing. Energy, you can provide duck energy days a whole lot more effectively with hot food than you can with native vegetation, right? So you could just plant all your habitat into hot food and you meet your duck energy days, but you're not giving ducks those nutrients that they need, right? So what we're doing is we're walking this fine line between trying to decide how many acres at the most do we have to plant in hot food that allows us to still have as much native vegetation as we can have, right? But still need our duck use days. We might have a 20,000 acre refuge and we want it to be in 20,000 acres of native vegetation. That only gets you half your duck use days. So, okay, can I get away with planting 100 acres of corn, 150, 200 acres? How many acres of corn do I have to plant that'll get me enough energy that still maximizes my native vegetation? Right? Makes sense? Okay. What do duck hunters say about us planting corn on refuges?
Draws them away from the blinds.
Yeah, draws them away from the duck blinds, right? Can we count on duck blinds on the corn or the hot food around duck blinds on private land to provide a reliable percentage of our energy for wintering ducks? Why not?
A lot of reasons.
Because, yeah, you're right. There are a lot of reasons, but the big one is because those ducks, like you were talking about the other day, they're being so heavily hammered on those blinds that they can't necessarily get the consistent access to that food that they're gonna get on the refuges, undisturbed access, right? They're gonna use as much energy trying to get to the food, and when are they gonna go to it, once they learn, when are they gonna go to that food? At night, right? And not during. So the hunters are complaining about something that the wildlife agencies have no control over. Like you say, shut down your hunting half the week, or 2/3 or 3/4, 5 days or 4 days out of 7, and hunt it the rest of the time, right? So yeah, there's a lot of concerns there. So back to the Fish and Wildlife Service. They've got to provide, enough duck use days, and the only way they can often do it is with hot foods, with crops. So several years ago, this was under the Obama administration, the leadership of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was very green and said, wait, you guys are planting genetically modified organisms on public land? Don't do that anymore, because there are problems with genetically modified organisms. And there are. What are the genetically modified organisms that were being planted on National Wildlife Refuge? Roundup Ready corn, Roundup Ready crops, Roundup Ready corn, Roundup Ready beans. And what Roundup Ready corn is, for those of you, if you don't know, Roundup, glyphosate, is an herbicide that's broad spectrum, kills all sorts of plants. Roundup Ready corn, Roundup Ready crops are crops that have a gene in it that makes them immune to Roundup. So you can spray Roundup over the top of corn and kill everything except for the corn, right? That's great. It makes it really easy to grow corn effectively, and Roundup, especially the generic Roundups, are pretty cheap. So no more GMO plants on refuges meant no more Roundup Ready corn. They could hardly find non-Roundup Ready corn seed, right? And if it was non-Roundup Ready, what did that mean? They couldn't control their weeds with glyphosate, so they had a lot more weeds in the corn. That was a real struggle for them. That rule has been backed up now. They can plant Roundup Ready corn, I believe, again now. But there is something to be said for occasionally lightening up on, this is kind of a hybrid model. You don't spray so often. You get some weeds coming up in your corn. And what do those weeds bring? They bring a little bit of diversity of plants. And they also bring invertebrates, because that's one of the other things that's valuable about non-hot foods is the invertebrates. So when we have corn or rice or beans or milo or whatever that we allow weeds to grow up in, we're not having to pay as much money for the herbicide. We're not having to pay as much money for the fuel and the time to spray that herbicide. We're getting a little bit greater diversity of native foods, plants, and invertebrates. We're not getting quite as much corn, but we're getting other stuff, so it's kind of a compromise measure. And we call that dirty corn or dirty rice or whatever, dirty crops, okay? Good? You with me? Well, the alternative, early successional, managed habitat for waterfowl is letting native vegetation grow. We call those moist soil units. Be clear, we're putting low head levees around these big units. These units might be a few acres up to 50 or 100 acres. If the area is super flat, with a low levee, you might be able to flood, 150, 200, 300 acres, right? If it's got a little bit of contour to it, you'll have to put more levees, right? So it's more stair stepping, right? So you might only be able to flood, 20 acres or 10 acres or 5 acres or 3 acres or something like that, right? But whether you're growing corn or moist soil units, you draw the water off in the summer and you let it dry out. You plant the crops, or you just let native vegetation grow. A variety of native grasses and millets and sedges and other plants, some legumes, just native stuff, letting it grow up. And then we flood it in the fall, okay? So some considerations with regard to these is that we want to be sure that for all these that our timing of flooding is right for the ducks and for the other birds. And we're not just managing ducks, we're managing shorebirds and other species as well, Okay, they're adapting to these floods. And we want to be sure that the drawing down the water, getting the water off in the spring happens at the right time and it's not too fast. What we used to do, the old model back in the mid-1900s and the 50s and 60s and 70s, is we would build these huge levees, 6 to 8 feet tall. We flood these, we pump these areas full of, like you got Gooch Unit A down there, right? You pump these units full of 6 to 8 feet of water, right? And you would do it like in November, as fast as you could, woof. And then the ducks come, right? And you hunt the heck out of them for 60 days, and at the end of that 60 days, you pump it out as fast as you can, woof, right? And that's managing for boats. You're managing for the boats, for those duck hunters to be able to get to the duck lines, but you're not managing for the waterfowl. You're not giving them what they need. So our new models is not these huge levees, not this fill it up in November, you know, just before the ducks come down in November, and dump it just as soon as they leave, but a gradual filling up and a gradual going down. I forget the exact percentage, but we've studied this heavily. And if you put a kernel of corn underwater at the end of the waterfowl, so if you do it underwater the first day of the waterfowl season, by the end of the waterfowl season, it's pretty much lost its nutritional value. Okay, so as it's inundated, it's losing nutritional value. So if you've got an area, guys, that's got a little bit of contour to it, and you've got corn growing on it, right? And you flood it a little bit. Okay, so here's first of the waterfowl season. You flood this. This is where the ducks are gonna feed, right? They're gonna eat that corn. And then gradually you flood a little bit more, and they'll eat this corn. And gradually you flood a little bit more, and they eat this corn. Alternatively, if you flood the whole thing now, they're gonna start eating a little bit of corn throughout the whole thing. And by the end of the season, any corn that they haven't eaten, it's gone bad anyway, or they're eating it and they're not getting any nutritional value out of it. So gradually flooding it up is ensuring that they're going to eat the corn, a little bit of corn that's available, and this corn up here that's high and dry isn't going bad in the meantime. You're saving this for later. Make sense? Same to a degree with moist soil units. I mentioned this idea that if you have an area that's super flat, you can put a levee and flood up a huge giant area. And there have been some places like Arkansas where it's just huge, super flat areas. Even some areas where they have farmed rice, where they've gone in with rice levelers in the past. These are machines that just make the land just flat as a fritter, flat as the floor right here. That's actually not great, because when you have contour, a little bit of contour in the land, that what we call microtopographic variation, provides variations in water depth that's going to allow different plants, a variety of different plants, to do well in different places. Just as some oaks do better at slightly higher elevations, so do some grasses and forbs do better at slightly higher or lower elevations. And different species of birds are going to prefer feeding in different depths as well. So having that variation in topography adds to that diversity. It's good for the waterfowl. Okay. So some of the plants that we're trying to farm, that we're hoping are going to grow, are millets. These are a bunch of species in the panicum genus. When they're little bitty, and guys, moist soil managers, these guys are artists. They have to know dozens of species. They're this tall. So they're out there in May looking, and they're looking at these grasses, and they see that little red stem at the bottom. Yep, that's some sort of a millet. They're seeing those sedges, the genus Carex or Cyperus esculentes, yellow nut sedge, with the triangular stems. They're seeing a variety of not just millets, but other grasses as well. And that's what they're looking for. And if they get something that they don't want, I'll come back to that, a whole bunch of things like cocklebur or sicklepod, Sesbania, this tall, this isn't good. We need to get rid of it. We could reflood it and kill this stuff for a week, or we could spray it, or we could disc it if it's dry enough for us to disc. We have to decide what to do to get rid of this and start over if we can. A little bit of this is going to be fine, but we don't want this to take over. So we want things like sprinkle top, or barnyard grass, or dozens of other species. And guys, I'm an upland forest ecologist, and I know upland forests pretty well. I am not a moist soil unit expert by any means, but that's something that people who are good at it get good at it over decades. Over decades of practice. It's truly a fine art. I showed you smartweed, polygonum. This is in the buckwheat family, the knotweed family, polygonum. Another common one is broadleaf arrowhead. You see this at Reelfoot. It is a common plant. Sagittaria, some people call it duck potato. If you go dig, grub in the water at the bases of these things and the roots, you can dig up these. You can just pull up these little nodules about this big. And they're edible. You don't want to eat them raw. You want to boil them, toss off the water, and boil them again, toss off the water, and boil them again. You can eat them. They taste kind of like potatoes or water chestnuts, kind of neat. But these all add to the diversity of food for waterfowl and things that are fine to see in the soil. So what are the water control structures that we use? They come in two primary flavors in this part of the world, okay? The old style that we used to use, and we still do sometimes, they have their advantages, is the screw gate, okay? And this is the pipe that goes through your levee, okay? And this has a pan, and you turn the screw and it lifts the gate up, okay? So the water escapes from the bottom. These next two, the flash board riser, this is where you've got a culvert, and then you cut a piece of culvert and weld it in there, and you put a frame and you put boards in the frame, okay? Or a drop log structure. And it's essentially the same thing, just built differently. It's built with a concrete form with slots. You drop logs in the slots. These allow, you put in as many logs as you want, and the water level rises to the top log. Water level rises to the top log, right? And when you want to let water out, you pull logs out to lower the water level. You have a smirk like you did that a bunch this summer, did you? Until you're sick of it?
With all three of them, me and Clara.
What's that?
Me and Clara.
Okay, well, with all three of them. Okay, so you know all about it. The major difference between these two and this one is what? Who can tell me?
You get to control specific height of water.
You can control the specific height or depth of the water with this one as well, if you do what?
If you want to let water in instead of letting it.
Well, I mean, that gets into something else. Usually, the water is behind the levee. We're not going to get that. We'll come back to that later. The water's behind the levee, so you open it, it's going to go in one direction, okay? The difference, since the water's coming out the bottom on these and the top on these, right? With these, let's say the water is at that top log right there, okay? And I want to lower it by 8 inches. If I've got two 2x4s in there, I just pull out the two 2x4s and walk away. And the water level is going to gradually go down until it lowers 4 inches and 4 inches, 8 inches, right? Here, if I want to lower the water level 8 inches, I raise that screw gate, water starts coming out. I gotta stand there for, I don't know, an hour, 3 days, I don't know, right? So for practical purposes, yeah, this lets you much more easily control the level of the water because it's gonna lower to the level that you want. Or if you're putting water in, you put in boards to the level that you want and you turn on the pump to pump water into the place and it's gonna go until it gets to that level and then the water's gonna go out. So this one, you can control water level, but you have to stay there, and most people don't. It's just impossible. So we hear stories about managers who would open the screw grate to lower the water level a little bit, go home for dinner. They're going to come back after dinner to close the screw gate. They accidentally fall asleep, and they get a call at 3 o'clock in the morning from a bunch of duck hunters who say their duck unit is dry, right? So with this, you don't have to worry about that. Good. That's the main thing. But there are other little considerations, like when you let water out from the bottom of this unit, where are most of the nutrients? Usually, they're down at the bottom, right? So you're letting more nutrients out, okay? And that might not be a good thing. You're wanting to hold as many nutrients, as you can in that system. So usually we like these things, right? There can be a time and a place for those, especially as a supplement, but these are great. The boards have their issues. Did you experience any issues, Piper? Like what?
If a beaver is anywhere near it, they chew on it.
Yeah, so beavers will chew up the boards, they'll even take a board away.
Yes, they will.
Or sometimes a board, if you get a heavy flood, a board will float up and out and float away, right? Did boards ever swell, so they get stuck in the slots? Boards will swell. So you can pay more for metal, aluminum slots, but they're a lot more expensive, and you didn't get that.
Sometimes you do.
Sometimes, not usually, yes. And you can micromanage these things too. You can get, you could have a 2x10, a 2x8, a 2x6, a 2x4, a 2x2. So you can really micromanage the levels with skinnier and skinnier boards, right? Makes sense? Good. Okay. I got about 4 more minutes to get as much as I can here. The third artificial managed wetland is a green tree reservoir or a GTR. This is an area growing hardwoods, typically oaks. Okay, the lowest level of trees, the trees that can do best in water, are cypress and tupelo, and those aren't good duck food. Okay, so what we're trying to manage for here is oaks for acorns. All right. For the most part. There was a lot of work creating and managing and studying green tree reservoirs, GTRs, back in the 1970s in Arkansas and Louisiana and other places. And after about a decade or two, wetland waterfowl biologists said, these things don't work, they suck. And most wetland and waterfowl biologists still say that, okay? The reason is because where a lot of these things were being built was in the annual floodplain, okay? And the problem is, when it's time to get the water off in the spring, you open up your gates at the bottom and try to get the water off. You're talking about, if you want to flood your unit, it might be that the river is so high that the water won't leave because the river behind the levee is as high as the water in front of the levee. And B, you're getting rain and runoff at the top end that's keeping your thing filled up. You can't empty it. And when the trees are breaking dormancy, they gotta have oxygen to their roots. If they can't get it, it'll kill them. It'll kill your trees. And that's what they did. They killed thousands and thousands and thousands of acres, millions of dollars worth of beautiful hardwood timber for waterfowl by putting levees around it. So they said GTRs don't work, they're bad. And the response of a good waterfowl biologist to that is, in the annual floodplain, you're damn right they are. But you get them up out of the floodplain, in the 10-year floodplain, in the 20-year floodplain, up in areas that don't typically flood. If you're super careful with them, they can be a fine supplement to natural functioning bottomland hardwood wetlands. Now, if you've got a natural functioning bottomland hardwood wetland, what you should do with it, hear me, this is important, you should leave it alone. There were people in TWRA, there were administrators in TWRA who buckled to political pressure from Clark Akers, the guy who successfully sued the Corps of Engineers, to levy up a piece of the Obion River Wildlife Management Area about 20 years ago, and almost killed 800 acres of oaks, doing something that they knew was ecologically a bad idea. They got written up by the Tennessee Department of Environment and Conservation for doing it without a permit. They shouldn't have done it. And our new administrators, I think, and hope no better than that. They haven't done anything like that lately. So when we build and manage a GTR, there's 3 critical factors: depth, duration, and frequency. What's the optimal depth, feeding depth for a puddle duck?
3 meters.
What's that?
3 meters.
Nope.
Is it inches?
What?
Is it inches?
Mm-hmm.
It's like 3 inches.
About 6 to 12 inches. about 6 to 12 inches. Maximum 18 inches, 1.5 feet, okay? Maximum 18 inches, so super shallow, all right? So you don't want to go too deep. And the other is duration and frequency. How long do you flood it? Guys, a green tree reservoir should not be flooded all winter. What do natural functioning riparian, annual floodplains do? You get a big rain, it floods up a little bit, and over the next 2 or 3 days, it goes back down. You get another big rain a couple weeks later, it goes up and it goes back down, right? It's not flooded all winter long. If you flood it all winter, if you flood it for 8 weeks, right? Every single winter, that's gonna stress those trees, even in dormancy, because in dormancy, they're not dead. They're still metabolizing. They're just metabolizing slowly. So 8 weeks of full volume is gonna stress them. So you can't do it all winter long. And once every few years, you shouldn't flood it at all. You should just let it rest. You should just let it be, right? So the duration is important and how frequently you flood it. That just goes to more little floods that draw down is better than one big long flood. I think the immersion kills and stresses trees. Okay, I'll finish with one last point. This is important. What I say here is easier said than done because natural flooding occurs from rain, right? The flooding that we're often doing, we're pumping water. And we're pumping water using electricity very often, or using diesel fuel or or natural gas even, we're using fuel. And that costs a lot of money to pump water. And it's a whole lot less expensive to pump up an area and leave it for for a couple months. And then let water out. And then pump it up and let it out. And pump it up again and let it out. Pump it up again. That gets a lot more expensive. So that's why we don't want to do it the way that's best for nature, because it's more expensive to do an artificial system anyway, not stop.